I cried for help after years of silence. My mother called me an attention seeker. It's strange how one sentence, one label, can dig so deep into your soul that it echoes louder than any scream you ever wanted to let out. For years, I thought the silence I carried was my shield. I thought if I didn't speak, if I swallowed everything, then maybe the storms in my house would eventually calm. But silence didn't save me. It only gave them more room to hurt me, and when I finally dared to break that silence, to let the truth out, the one person I had hoped would hold me closer, my own mother, pushed me further away. I've replayed that moment in my head countless times. The way her eyes narrowed, her lips curling like I had committed the worst betrayal by opening my mouth. The way her words dripped with disdain, not concern. She didn't say I was brave for speaking. She didn't say she was sorry for not noticing, for not protecting me. She said I was dramatic. That I just wanted attention. That I was making things bigger than they were. And in that instant, I felt myself collapse inside, like all the courage I had spent years building was ripped from me in one blow. But before I ever found my voice, there were years, long, painful years, where silence was the only thing I knew. Silence became my language, my survival tactic. I learned early that speaking up led to punishment. That expressing pain only made me weaker in their eyes. So I hid it all, the bruises, the tears, the thoughts that scared me in the middle of the night. I tucked them deep inside, where no one could see, where even I sometimes pretended they didn't exist. My stepfather was the kind of man who smiled in public but turned into something else the moment the front door closed. His footsteps in the hallway carried weight, the kind that made my chest tighten and my stomach twist. He had a way of entering a room and making the air colder. He didn't always need to raise his voice. Sometimes it was just the look in his eyes, the kind that told me I was already guilty of something I hadn't even done yet. The punishments came in many forms. Sometimes it was the sting of his hand across my cheek, so sudden it left me dizzy. Other times it was the leather belt, its crack echoing in my ears long after the welt had risen on my skin. And sometimes, maybe worst of all, it was the silence. The cold shoulder. The deliberate ignoring of my existence, like I wasn't even worth the energy to scold. That silence told me I didn't matter, that I was invisible in my own home. But even more painful than his cruelty was my mother's complicity. She wasn't always like this, or maybe she was and I just didn't see it before. When I was younger, before he came along, she would sing me to sleep, brush my hair gently, tell me we were a team. I believed her. I clung to her as my safe place. But when he entered our lives, something in her shifted. It was as if she had to prove her loyalty to him, even at the expense of me. Every time he lashed out, she stood back. Sometimes she looked away. And sometimes, worst of all, she joined in, not with her hands, but with her words, sharp enough to slice into me just as deeply as any belt. I don't think people understand how much damage it does when the person who gave you life refuses to protect it. My stepfather's rage hurt my body, but my mother's silence broke my soul. As a child, you think parents are supposed to protect you. You believe that no matter what happens, there is someone who will shield you from the world. When that belief shatters, it doesn't just leave you unprotected, it leaves you questioning your very worth. If your own mother won't defend you, who will? If your own mother thinks your pain is exaggeration, then maybe it isn't pain at all. Maybe you really are just broken. I carried that thought with me everywhere. At school, I walked the halls with my head low, trying to blend in, trying not to draw attention. I became skilled at smiling when people looked, nodding when they asked how I was. My friends didn't know. My teachers didn't know. I lived two lives, the one on the outside, quiet and obedient, and the one on the inside, screaming into a void no one could hear. But there were cracks in my mask. There were days when the pain sat too close to the surface, when my eyes burned from crying the night before, when my body ached in places I couldn't explain. Sometimes teachers would look at me with concern, asking if I was tired, if I was okay. And I wanted so badly to tell them. I wanted someone to notice the truth without me having to say it. Because saying it felt impossible. Saying it meant risking everything. Silence became a prison, but it also felt like safety. As long as I didn't speak, as long as I pretended, I could survive another day. But survival isn't the same as living. Survival is holding your breath underwater, hoping you don't drown before someone pulls you up. And for years, I was drowning quietly. There were nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could do it. The thought of running away crossed my mind more times than I can count. I imagined slipping out into the night, disappearing into the world where no one could hurt me. But then I would think about being caught, about the fury in his eyes, about the disappointment in hers, and I would freeze. Fear anchored me in place. Other nights, darker thoughts crept in. Thoughts about ending it all, about escaping in the only way I knew I could control. I never acted on them, but they sat there, whispering in my ear, reminding me that I had a choice, even if it was a terrifying one. What stopped me wasn't hope at first. It was fear. Fear of what came after. Fear of the unknown. So I stayed. I endured. I told myself maybe it would get better. Maybe she would remember who she used to be. Maybe he would grow tired of his cruelty. But the maybes never came true. The day I finally broke my silence wasn't planned. It wasn't a moment I had built up to with courage and strategy. It was a crack in the dam, a moment when the weight of it all became too heavy to carry alone. I remember sitting in class, my sleeves tucked down to hide the fresh marks on my arms, my throat tight from holding back tears. My teacher asked a simple question, "Are you okay?" and something inside me snapped. I didn't tell her everything right away. I just whispered that things weren't okay at home. My voice shook. My hands trembled. But the words spilled out before I could stop them. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and didn't roll their eyes. Didn't call me dramatic. Didn't say I wanted attention. She just listened. And I realized how starved I was for that, for someone to believe me. But when the truth reached my mother, everything I feared came crashing down. I thought maybe, just maybe, she would finally see. That hearing my pain out loud, hearing it validated by someone else, would wake her up. But it didn't. Instead, she looked at me like I had betrayed her. She said I was lying. That I was overreacting. That I just wanted attention. Those words hurt more than any belt ever could. Because in them, she wasn't just denying my pain, she was denying me. She was saying I wasn't worth believing. That my truth was an inconvenience. That her comfort, her relationship, her image mattered more than my survival. And yet, even as her words crushed me, even as I felt the weight of them settle into my bones, a small voice inside whispered that I couldn't go back. I had already spoken. I had already broken the silence. And no matter what she called me, I knew deep down that my pain was real. That I wasn't just an attention seeker. I was a survivor, clawing my way toward something better, even if it terrified me. That was the beginning of everything. The beginning of my fight. The beginning of reclaiming my story, piece by painful piece. After that day, something shifted in me. Not because my world suddenly got better, but because I realized it never would if I kept pretending. Speaking up didn't bring the rescue I secretly hoped for, it brought rejection. But it also planted a seed inside me, a fragile little reminder that I wasn't crazy. My pain was real, even if my mother refused to acknowledge it. The days that followed were strange. At school, I felt exposed, like everyone could see through me, like the words I had whispered had written themselves across my forehead. I wondered if my teacher had told others, if people were looking at me differently. But at home, nothing was said aloud. Not by my mother, not by him. It was as if my confession never existed, as if I had only imagined the whole thing. That silence was almost worse than the denial. It left me constantly on edge, waiting for some kind of explosion, some kind of punishment that never quite came. But in subtle ways, life did get harder. My mother became colder, her eyes sharper whenever she looked at me. Meals grew quieter, her words clipped and laced with irritation. If I asked a simple question, she sighed like I was a burden. If I sat too close, she shifted away as if I carried something contagious. She never said it outright, but I could feel it in every gesture. My voice had cost me her affection. And then there was him. My stepfather didn't need to say much either. The smirk on his face told me everything. He had won. He had managed to not only break me but to make my own mother doubt me. He walked taller in the house, his authority unchallenged. If I tried to avoid him, he found ways to corner me, asking for help with something, standing too close in the kitchen, brushing past me in narrow hallways. Little reminders that this was his territory, not mine. At school, my teacher continued to check in, her eyes searching mine whenever she passed by my desk. Sometimes she asked if I was okay, and I always gave the same answer, I'm fine. Not because I wanted to lie, but because I was terrified of what would happen if I said anything more. She had already seen what happened when I broke the silence. I wasn't ready to risk it again. But even so, something about her attention gave me strength. The simple act of being noticed, of being asked, reminded me I wasn't invisible everywhere. That mattered more than I could put into words. The months blended into one another, a blur of school days and tense evenings. I kept my head down, did my chores, tried not to provoke anyone. But there was always this weight on my chest, this sense that I was walking a tightrope with no safety net. I couldn't shake the fear that one wrong move would send me crashing down. There were nights when I sat by my window, looking out at the streetlights, watching the occasional car pass by. I used to imagine that one of those cars could take me away. That if I could just gather the courage to run, I might find a world where people didn't hurt each other this way. But then I would think about how little I had, how unprepared I was, how quickly I might end up lost or worse. And so I stayed, trapped not by walls but by fear. Sometimes I wondered if maybe my mother was right. Maybe I was dramatic. Maybe other kids had it worse. Maybe I was selfish for wanting more than what I had. Those thoughts ate at me, twisting around inside my head until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. But then I would catch my reflection in the mirror, see the faint yellow of a fading bruise, and I would remember. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. I wasn't imagining it. The hardest part wasn't the pain itself, it was the loneliness. The feeling that no one truly saw me, that my truth was too inconvenient for anyone to handle. Even my friends at school, the ones I laughed with during lunch, couldn't really know me. They saw the version I put on display, the quiet girl who nodded and smiled, never revealing what she carried home each day. Sometimes I wanted to tell them. I wanted to test the waters, to let a piece of my truth slip out and see if they would believe me. But the fear of their doubt kept me silent. If my own mother didn't believe me, why would they? So I built walls around myself, brick by brick, until I felt untouchable. But inside those walls, I was crumbling. One memory stands out like a scar I'll never forget. It was a Sunday afternoon, the house quiet except for the hum of the television in the living room. My mother was folding laundry while he sat nearby, flipping through channels. I had just walked in from the kitchen when I heard her mutter something under her breath. It was sharp, laced with annoyance, and though I didn't catch every word, I heard enough. She said I was needy. That I was always looking for sympathy. That I exaggerated things to make myself look like a victim. The words burned. Not because they were new, she had called me an attention seeker before, but because she wasn't even saying them to me. She was saying them to him. Aligning herself with him. Painting me as the problem in the story, as if my existence was an inconvenience to their happiness. I froze in the doorway, my throat closing up, my eyes stinging. They didn't even notice me standing there. And somehow, that made it worse. I wasn't even important enough for them to lower their voices. That night, I curled up in bed and let the tears flow freely. For once, I didn't try to swallow them down. I cried until my chest hurt, until my pillow was soaked. And in the midst of that storm, something inside me shifted again. I realized I couldn't keep waiting for her to change. I couldn't keep hoping she would one day wake up and see me, believe me, love me like she once had. That person was gone. Or maybe she had never been real. Either way, I couldn't live my life waiting for someone else to save me. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a heaviness in my chest, but also with a tiny flicker of determination. I didn't know what freedom looked like yet. I didn't know how I would get there. But I knew I had to start building it for myself, piece by piece, even if no one else stood by me. It started with small things. Keeping a journal hidden beneath my mattress, scribbling down my thoughts late at night so they wouldn't eat me alive. Spending more time at the library after school, losing myself in books that offered escape and reminded me there was a bigger world beyond my house. Even imagining a future for myself, however blurry, felt like rebellion. Of course, none of these things erased the pain. The bruises still came. The words still cut. The loneliness still haunted me. But now I had something else too, something fragile but powerful. Hope. It wasn't the loud, roaring kind of hope you see in movies. It was quiet, shaky, sometimes barely there. But it was mine. And with every page I wrote in that hidden journal, with every story I read at the library, with every dream I let myself imagine, that hope grew a little stronger. Looking back, I think that's what kept me alive. Not the belief that my mother would change, not the fantasy of being rescued, but the slow realization that I could rescue myself. That I could choose to believe in my own worth, even if no one else did. And once that realization took root, the silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. I still carried it, yes, but now it wasn't my only companion. Now I had a voice too, however faint, and it was waiting for the right moment to rise again. Hope is a strange thing. At first, it felt like a betrayal. Like I wasn't allowed to imagine a life outside of the one I had been given. Every time I dreamed of escape or pictured myself living differently, guilt crept in, whispering that I was ungrateful, that I should just accept my life the way it was. But no matter how many times I tried to bury it, the hope always came back. It was like a stubborn weed growing through cracks in the concrete. The journal became my closest companion. Late at night, when the house was quiet and I could hear the steady hum of the refrigerator, I pulled it out from under my mattress. The pages became the only place I told the truth. I wrote about the fear, the pain, the way my mother's words echoed inside me. I wrote about the things I wished she would say instead, the comfort I longed for, the apologies I knew would never come. And sometimes, I wrote about the future, about who I might become if I ever got free. Those scribbled words were my lifeline. They reminded me that my voice existed, even if no one else wanted to hear it. And slowly, they gave me courage to start speaking in small ways outside the pages. It began with my teacher. She hadn't given up on me, even after I clammed up and insisted I was fine. She still asked. Still noticed. One day after class, she stopped me as I was packing up my things. Her voice was gentle, her eyes steady, and she simply said she was there if I ever needed to talk. I nodded and left without saying much, but her words lingered. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, "Someone believes me." I didn't tell her everything right away. Trust, once shattered, takes time to rebuild. But slowly, in bits and pieces, I began to open up. Not always with words, sometimes with just a look, a pause, the way I lingered when everyone else had left the classroom. She seemed to understand. She didn't push me, didn't demand explanations. She just offered presence. And that, more than anything, helped me feel less alone. At home, nothing changed. If anything, the tension grew thicker, like the walls themselves were closing in. My mother's patience with me was razor thin. My stepfather's smirks became more deliberate, as if he could sense I was pulling away internally, even if I hadn't yet broken free physically. But inside, I felt a tiny shift. Their control over me wasn't absolute anymore. I had a place, however small, where I was seen. And that knowledge became a kind of armor. The library also became a sanctuary. I would lose myself for hours in books, wandering through stories of people who overcame impossible odds, who found love, who discovered freedom. Those characters became like friends to me, their victories proof that suffering didn't have to be the final chapter. Sometimes I even imagined myself as one of them, the hero of my own story. It felt laughable at first, me, a hero? But even pretending gave me strength. The more time I spent outside the house, the more I realized how much the world had to offer. I began to notice the way the air felt lighter when I wasn't under his gaze, the way my shoulders relaxed when my mother wasn't watching me with suspicion. I savored those small freedoms, carried them back into the house with me like contraband. But of course, they noticed. My mother asked why I stayed late at school so often. I muttered excuses about homework, about helping teachers, about losing track of time in the library. She didn't press much, but I could feel her irritation simmering beneath the surface. My stepfather, on the other hand, just smiled that same smile, the one that made my stomach twist. I avoided his eyes, but inside I thought, one day you won't have this power over me. The nights remained the hardest. Darkness seemed to magnify every fear, every doubt. Sometimes I would hear them talking in their bedroom, their muffled voices drifting down the hallway. I always strained to listen, hoping for some scrap of kindness, some proof that my mother still thought of me with love. But most of the time, I heard nothing of the sort. Just the steady rhythm of their lives carrying on without me, as if I didn't exist. And yet, in the stillness of those nights, I began to make promises to myself. Promises that one day I would leave. That one day I would build a life where I wasn't silenced, where my truth wasn't treated like a nuisance. I didn't know when or how, but the promise itself became a beacon. One evening, after another tense dinner where barely a word was spoken, I slipped outside into the backyard. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. I tilted my head back and stared at the stars, scattered like diamonds across the black sky. And for the first time, instead of feeling small beneath them, I felt possibility. The universe was so vast, so much bigger than my pain. Somewhere out there was a version of me who wasn't trapped in silence. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, hold on. The years blurred together in that rhythm of endurance. Pain, survival, secret pockets of hope. There were setbacks, days when I felt crushed beneath their weight, when my mother's words sliced into me so deeply I thought I might never recover. But then there were also moments of unexpected strength, when I stood a little taller, when I dared to believe I was more than what they said I was. Looking back, I realize it wasn't one single act of bravery that saved me. It was thousands of tiny choices. Choosing to write instead of giving up. Choosing to stay late at the library. Choosing to whisper the truth to my teacher, even in fragments. Choosing to imagine a future for myself, even when it seemed impossible. Every one of those choices was a rebellion. A defiance against the silence they tried to trap me in. And though I didn't know it then, those rebellions were shaping me into someone stronger than I ever thought I could be. And eventually, the silence that once felt like my prison began to transform. It no longer belonged to them. It was mine. A quiet strength, a space where I could hear my own voice rising, little by little, waiting for the day it would finally roar. The older I grew, the harder it became to ignore the cracks in my family. When I was younger, I told myself maybe it was all my fault, maybe if I were better, quieter, less needy, then things would be different. But with time, I began to see more clearly. It wasn't me who was broken. It was them. My stepfather wore his cruelty like a second skin. He didn't lash out every day, but he didn't need to. The unpredictability was enough to keep me on edge. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway still made my chest tighten, even when he passed by without saying a word. His presence alone was like a storm cloud hanging over the house, always threatening to break. My mother, though, was harder to understand. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when her old self seemed to peek through. When she would ask if I wanted a sandwich or if I'd finished my homework. When she would brush past me and place her hand lightly on my shoulder, almost without realizing it. Those little gestures gave me hope that maybe she still cared, that maybe she was just too scared to show it. But just as quickly, the coldness would return. The sharpness in her voice, the way she sided with him without hesitation, the way she dismissed me whenever I tried to speak. It was like she was two different people, and I never knew which one I would get. What hurt most was that even in her kindest moments, there was a distance. A gap between us that hadn't been there when I was little. She no longer looked at me the way a mother looks at her child. She looked at me the way someone looks at a burden they wish they didn't have to carry. That realization was devastating. But it also fueled something inside me. If I couldn't count on her to protect me, then I had to learn to protect myself. At school, I began to carve out small spaces of belonging. I wasn't the loudest or the most popular, but I found a few people who made me feel less invisible. Friends who didn't know the full story but who laughed with me, who asked about my day, who offered me a kind of normalcy I didn't get at home. I cherished those moments more than they ever knew. My teacher, too, remained a quiet anchor in my life. She never pushed too hard, never pried, but her presence reminded me that there were adults in the world who cared, who believed in children, who didn't turn away when things got difficult. That alone gave me a strange sense of power. If one person could see me, maybe more could. Maybe the world wasn't as blind as my mother wanted me to believe. Still, the nights were the hardest. That's when the silence pressed in the heaviest, when the doubts tried to choke me. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, every creak of the floorboards sounding like footsteps. Sometimes I heard my mother and stepfather talking in their room, their muffled laughter twisting like a knife. How could she laugh with him? How could she share joy with the same man who brought so much pain into my life? Those were the nights I wrote the most. I poured everything onto the page, my anger, my confusion, my longing. I wrote letters I never sent, words I wished I could speak out loud. I imagined sliding those pages under my mother's door, forcing her to read them, to finally see me. But I never did. Fear always stopped me. Fear of her dismissal, her scorn, her coldness. The journal became not just my outlet but my record. Proof that what I endured was real. That I wasn't just making it up. Every entry was a piece of my truth carved into the world, a reminder that no matter what they said, I had lived it. Over time, I noticed something else happening too. The shame that had once swallowed me whole began to loosen its grip. For so long, I had believed their lies, that I was dramatic, that I was an attention seeker, that I deserved the way I was treated. But writing the truth over and over made me start to see it differently. It wasn't me who was wrong. It wasn't me who was broken. And slowly, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved better. That shift didn't change everything overnight. I still lived under their roof, still endured their coldness and cruelty. But inside, something was changing. My silence wasn't just submission anymore, it was strategy. It was me biding my time, building strength, waiting for the day I could finally step into the life I deserved. One moment stands out vividly in my memory. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes after dinner, when my stepfather walked in. He stood behind me for a moment, close enough that I felt the heat of his presence. My stomach nodded, bracing for whatever might come. But instead of speaking, he just smirked and walked out, his footsteps fading down the hall. In the past, I would have crumbled inside, shaken by the encounter. But this time, as I stood at the sink, I felt something different. Anger. Not the kind that consumes you, but the kind that strengthens you. A fire in my chest that whispered, "You will not have power over me forever." That realization was like a spark catching flame. For so long, I had seen myself only as a victim, powerless and trapped. But in that moment, I began to see myself as something else too, a survivor. And survivors are stronger than their oppressors ever want them to be. From that day forward, I carried myself a little differently. I still kept my head down at home, still avoided unnecessary conflict. But inside, I stood taller. I reminded myself daily that their words didn't define me. That their cruelty wasn't a reflection of my worth but of their brokenness. It was a quiet rebellion, one they probably didn't even notice. But I noticed. And that was enough to keep me going. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't going to be silent forever. One day, my voice would be too strong to ignore. One day, I would walk away from that house and never look back. One day, I would tell my story, not as a cry for attention, but as proof that I had survived. And when that day came, I promised myself, the world would finally hear me. When I was 15, I made the mistake of speaking up at school. I had been sitting in the counselor's office after skipping lunch because I couldn't bear to sit among the other kids pretending everything was normal. The counselor asked me gently if I was okay. For the first time, I thought about telling the truth. My hands shook, my throat burned, but I whispered that things weren't good at home. She leaned in, asked me if I was safe, and in a rush of shame and desperation, I told her that my stepfather was cruel and my mother didn't care. I expected relief, some kind of rescue. Instead, I got dread. She promised she wouldn't share anything without my consent unless I was in immediate danger, but she gently pushed me to let her talk to my mom. I hesitated, begged her not to, but she reminded me that parents had to be involved for certain things. My heart sank. By the time I got home that night, my mother was waiting in the living room, her arms crossed and her expression tight with fury. She didn't say a word at first, just stared at me like I had ruined her life. Then she told me I had embarrassed her, made her look like a bad mother, and that I was turning into an attention seeker just like my aunt who everyone in the family gossiped about. The punishment that followed was cold and silent. She didn't hit me, but she iced me out completely. No eye contact, no warmth, no meals left out for me. I felt like a ghost in my own house. Even my stepfather seemed to take pity on me during that time, though it was laced with cruelty. He told me I was lucky my mom didn't throw me out, that I should stop whining and start appreciating all she did for me. It was another lesson in silence. I realized then that speaking up only made things worse. My counselor never asked again, and I never volunteered the truth. High school became a battlefield. I learned to blend in, to laugh at the right times, to mimic normalcy even when inside I was fractured. I excelled in some subjects and failed miserably in others, not because of ability but because of focus. Some nights I couldn't study because I was too busy bracing for the next explosion of temper at home. Other nights I stayed awake with my heart pounding, convinced something terrible was going to happen. Anxiety became my constant companion. But even in the darkest moments, small sparks of hope appeared. A teacher who slipped me encouraging notes on my essays, telling me I had talent. A friend who invited me to her house for sleepovers, giving me a glimpse of what a loving family could feel like. Little by little, those glimpses kept me alive. They reminded me that the world was bigger than my mother's house, bigger than the cage of silence I had been forced into. One memory stands out more than the rest. I was 17, sitting in the library, when I stumbled across a book about survivors of childhood trauma. I opened it and began reading the stories of people who had been through things eerily similar to mine. For the first time, I didn't feel completely insane. These people weren't weak or dramatic. They were survivors. That book planted a seed in me that maybe, just maybe, I could survive too. Still, every time I tried to imagine escape, fear pulled me back. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, calling me dramatic, ungrateful, an attention seeker. She had repeated those words so often they felt tattooed into my skin. It would take years to peel them off, to realize they were projections of her own failures, not reflections of my worth. By the time I was approaching graduation, I had become an expert at hiding. Hiding bruises, hiding tears, hiding the gnawing ache of being unloved in my own home. Outwardly, I looked like any other teenager trying to balance schoolwork and part-time jobs. Inwardly, I was a storm. Every smile I forced felt like it might crack into sobs if anyone looked too closely. College was a dream I held onto with both hands. Not because I wanted the classes, not even because I loved learning, but because I believed it was my only ticket out. I studied obsessively, pouring everything I had into assignments just to create the possibility of leaving. I knew if I stayed, I'd drown. I worked after school at a cafe, saving every coin I could. My mother mocked me, telling me I was wasting my time because people like us didn't get ahead. But that only made me more determined. Then came the night that sealed my decision. My stepfather had been drinking, and the tension in the house was unbearable. He snapped at my mother, she snapped back, and somehow the blame turned to me. I remember standing there, frozen, as he raised his hand like he had so many times before. My mother didn't step in. She turned her head. That moment burned into me deeper than the slap itself. It was proof that she would never, ever protect me. I went upstairs that night and wrote in my journal for hours. My hands shook, the pages filled with ink stains where tears had fallen, but I kept writing. I wrote about how I couldn't live in silence anymore, how I had to leave even if it meant going alone with nothing. That was the first time I declared to myself that I deserved more than pain. Graduation came and went. The day I walked across that stage, I felt like I was stepping out of chains. My mother didn't clap. She sat in the audience with tight lips and cold eyes, as if my achievement was an insult to her. My stepfather didn't even come. But I didn't care. I walked with my head high, clutching that diploma like it was a passport to freedom. College wasn't easy. I didn't have financial support, and my savings barely covered tuition. I worked multiple jobs, often running on 4 hours of sleep. There were nights when exhaustion made me question if it was worth it. But then I remembered the house I had left behind, the silence I had endured, the years of being told I was nothing but an attention seeker. And I kept pushing. Still, the scars of my childhood followed me. I struggled to trust people, always waiting for the moment they would betray me. I kept friends at a distance, convinced that if they knew the real me, the broken me, they would walk away. Relationships were almost impossible. Anytime someone got too close, I sabotaged it. Part of me still heard my mother's voice whispering that I was dramatic, unworthy, and difficult to love. It wasn't until I sat in a campus support group that something shifted. The group was small, just a handful of students, but as they shared their stories, I felt that same spark I had felt years earlier in the library. I wasn't alone. And when I finally gathered the courage to share my own story, shaky and raw, I wasn't met with ridicule. I wasn't met with dismissal. I was met with nods, compassion, and quiet recognition. That moment cracked something open in me. I began to realize that silence had been my prison, but it didn't have to be my future. For so long, my mother's betrayal had defined me. Her refusal to acknowledge my pain had silenced me. But each time I spoke my truth, even in small, trembling ways, I reclaimed a piece of myself. That night after the support group, I walked back to my dorm feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I realized that maybe my voice had power. Maybe I wasn't just the broken child my mother had painted me to be. I had lived through silence, endured cruelty, and carried scars that no one could see, but I was still here. I thought about that phrase she always used, calling me an attention seeker whenever I dared to cry for help. For so long, it had been a weapon used to shut me down. But walking across campus under the dim glow of the streetlights, I began to see it differently. Wanting attention wasn't weakness. Wanting someone to notice your pain, to care, to help, that was human. And I was human, deserving of care and love just like anyone else. Part of me still carried fear. The silence I had been trapped in for years didn't disappear overnight. But something had shifted. I had spoken, and the world hadn't ended. I had told my truth, and instead of being cast aside, I had been met with understanding. It was small, but it was enough to plant hope in me. That night, I promised myself something: I would never go back to being voiceless. My story wasn't over yet, but the silence that had once suffocated me was starting to break. For the first time in my life, I began to believe that healing was possible.